Booking the interview. The podcast. The podcaster's champion. Deshon Porter. He learned to speak into the dark first. The microphones in Peter's little studio were forgiving. They took whatever he offered, quiet confessions, jokes that landed for no one but him, the half-finished sentences that still felt like company. 3 years had taught him how to make in a mind empty house sound alive, how to braid silence into a broadcast that made strangers feel like friends. On air, he wasn't Prince DJ, smooth voice, warm laugh, a host who could turn grief into something listenable. Off air, he was still Peter, the widower who kept a pot of tea warm on the stove and pretended not to check the car calendar. When he first heard the name Pure Diamond, it was a tag on a message from a producer. "We can get her on next week. She's in the title match." He nearly scrolled past it until a clip began to play. Crowd noise like thunder, a woman's footing, and a direct, laughing voice that owned a room as easily as breath. Pure Diamond was her stage name in the ring. The clip cut to her saying, "They call me Diamond because I don't break, only shines harder." Peter laughed aloud without meaning to. The sound startled him, too bright in his math. Quiet kitchen. He put the clip on loop while he brewed his tea and found himself tracing the cadence of her words with his own mouth. He meant to call his producer back and say no. He was a podcast about second chances and small, honest stories, not sensational sports. But the next morning, he booked her, meeting Pure Diamond. The interview began on a Saturday afternoon. He sat in the familiar glow of his console, the room filled with the low hum of computers and his own practiced calm. When Pure Diamond clicked into the call, the studio filled with a different energy, like a sudden gust that shook open windows. She greeted him as if they were old acquaintances, her voice a blend of adrenaline and easy humor. "Peter," she said, "I've heard your show. You make people feel less alone." He felt something loosen, some small tight knot in his chest. "And you've been making a lot of people roar," he replied. "How does that feel, the roar?" She thought about it for a moment. "Scary," she said. "Also like the universe finally answering. I grew up thinking I'd be quiet forever. Now the quiet is a stranger." They spoke for an hour. He asked about childhood injuries, the discovery of wrestling in a high school gym, the way she learned to turn pain into choreography. She spoke with the calm of someone shaped by struggle and the ferocity of someone who chose to keep going. Off air, she answered the small questions no one thought to ask. "Do you ever get scared? What was the first match like? Who taught you to sign your name in the way you do for fans?" After the call, Peter replayed a moment in which Pure Diamond sighed and said, "Sometimes, all I want is a quiet room and someone who understands my silence." He found himself telling the audience that night about her not as spectacle, but as a person who lived with both the glare and the quiet. Listeners wrote in with emails that said their palms itched to see her ring, their hearts fluttered when she landed a move. Their own wounds had been soothed by her example. His inbox filled with the small, human fallout of watching one brave another interview. They did more interviews. He met her at a charity event where she signed posters with a grin and the same careful fingers that pinned an opponent in the ring. At a wrestling gym the next week, he watched her train. She moved like a language. Gesture, shift, breath. When she took him through the basics, she laughed at his awkwardness and helped him, patient and fierce. The gap between their lives felt like a wide street crossed step by step. He spoke into his recorder afterwards with his heart in his throat, trying to make sense of the new shape of his days. He told himself it was curiosity, admiration, the natural arc of an interviewer, and a compelling subject. But he began to measure his weeks not by the number of downloads or the guests scheduled, but by the messages they exchanged at odd hours. A picture of a torn glove, a voice note after a long training session saying, "I kept thinking of your question about silence today." He found himself curating playlist songs she might like, songs for her match day, and sending them with the casual tremor of someone handing over a little protection. When Pure Diamond told him she was set to win the title, she announced it like someone saying she'd baked a pie. She didn't cry or boast, she stated a fact. The arena would be packed, the cameras would be hungry, the world would expect her to be invincible. Later, alone, Peter listened to the pressers, the interviews, the passival bravado that softened like wax the closer she came to the ring. The night of the match, he didn't want to be a listener behind a console. He took a ticket with his own name on it and sat in the third row, the lights slicing his face into gold and shadow. Seeing her there, in person, made him feel like he'd been holding his breath for months. She walked out like a comet-flashing costume, a W-ace, focused, fierce face. When their eyes met across the lights for the briefest second, she gave him a small nod, a private semaphore that said, "I see you." He returned it like a benediction. A match. The match itself was a choreography of edge and grace. She took hard hits and when she fell, she broke with the art of someone who knew how to turn pain into story. Between the sequences, he noticed the tenderness in her ring work, the brief gestures of protectiveness toward smaller opponents, the way she checked their breathing after a hard move. It undercut the violence with humanity, and he felt his heart opening like a window left ajar. In the final round, she moved with the absolute clarity of someone who had decided what mattered. The crowd rose like wind. When the referee's hand hit the mat for a 3 count, the arena fractured into a scream that felt like rain. She had won. Pure Diamond stood in the center of the ring with the belt around her waist, and looked less like a champion than like someone who'd remembered how to come home. After the match, backstage was a blur of towels, shouting, and cameras. He found her leaning against a folding table, hair damp, eyes luminous with something that wasn't just adrenaline relief, maybe, and the vulnerable bloom of accomplishment. She saw him and smiled in a way that broke the last of his rules. About distance. "You came," she said, and her voice was a soft, stunned thing. "I wouldn't have missed it," he replied, and realized he meant more than the match. "You were brilliant." She reached for his hand without thinking about the cameras, and he felt the calloused warmth of a life lived in motion. Up close, she smelled like eucalyptus, and sweat, and something sweet, like old books. He wanted to fold into that scent and stay. They spent the night on slow silence, sharing cigarettes under a buzzing, fluorescent light, talking in fragments about everything and nothing. She told him how she'd learned to channel her fear into focus. He told her about his wife, about how grief had once shaped him like a cliff. She listened with that fierce attention. She brought to the ring, full, unflinching. "How do you do it?" she asked finally. "Get up every morning and talk to people about loss?" He thought of his late wife's hands as she adjusted a blanket on a cold night. He thought of the small things that tied his days together. "You make room for it," he said. "You don't hide it. You speak it loud enough that it doesn't swallow you." She nodded, as if this explained everything and nothing, the kind of answer that's both map and mystery. "Maybe that's why I wanted you here," she said. "You make bravery feel domestic, like something ordinary." A growing relationship. Over the weeks that followed, their relationship unfolded in the careful way two people learn the contours of the other's life. There were awkward dinners with her teammates, where he was the quiet man with 1,000 stories in his ears. Her putting a hand on his back before the bell, the way she texted him mid-tour with pictures of hotel room sunsets. He introduced her to his listeners as his friend, then as his companion, then, finally, as something that made the intro segment stutter the way good things do when they arrive too quickly to be named. Their love didn't erase the old grief. There were nights when Peter would wake and find the weight of his past pressing behind his ribs like a remembered song. He would go into the studio and speak honestly into the mic about the way new love could feel both treacherous and tender. His audience wrote in to say they were glad, relieved, guilty, afraid, mirror letters that helped him map what was happening inside. Pure Diamond won more than matches. She learned to lean on someone who could hold stories as gently as he held his board of faders, and Peter learned how to stand in a ring of light without imagining it as a stage for his loneliness. They taught each other the vocabulary of care, asking, listening, resting. They found small rituals that stitched days together: coffee before dawn, playlists on the road, a shared margin of silence after a long show. Months later, when a producer asked Peter if the friendship had complicated his professional life, he smiled and said, "If anything, it taught me how to be braver on the air. It's one thing to tell people how to survive, it's another to practice it." The night Pure Diamond defended her title, Peter watched from the press box, his hand finding hers in the darkness. The match was fierce, the crowd a living thing. Afterward, in a corridor smudged with sweat and perfume, she turned to him and placed the belt in his hands. "Keep it safe," she said simply. He held the heavy trophy like it was the only proof he'd had of beauty lately. "I will," he promised.